was 100% manual machining back in 2007 is now being replaced by CNC machines, bigger machines, more accurate machines, more efficient machines.
You know, L&H has proven that we will stand behind our product, and that level of trust is there.
Welcome to Mining Now. I'm your host, Jared Downey, and today we're in Sheridan, Wyoming, filming at the L&H Industrial Facility. We've got Dan Myashkov. I was doing great. And then
you had it.
And then we've got Cameron Hawtin. Dan, you're the mobile equipment product line manager here at L&H. And then Cam, you followed us here. You're from Canada.
I am, yeah.
Where are you based?
Born and bred in Edmonton, Alberta region, St. Albert, Alberta, and now reside in Sherwood Park.
And then you're the account manager?
Business development manager for the oil sands.
Okay. What sort of, maybe just quickly walk us through what's your role?
So as the product line manager, I have kind of oversight of products and services that we offer for certain product lines. Obviously L&H is big in a lot of different industries, a lot of different product lines, whether that's electric rope shovels, drag lines, mineral processing. Obviously mobile equipment is one of mine, and a few others. So I oversee those product lines, and I help kind of direct which way we're going to go as far as products, services, areas to target, et cetera, et cetera.
What's your day-to-day?
Pushing our product lines on the mobile side, now that we kind of dove into a couple of years ago, as well as, the shovel business, which has been L&H's bread and butter in the oil sands region going back to 2013. So, just customer interactions, making things are running smoothly, working with Dan and the product line managers, product line directors, the ownership group, trying to make sure that, our strategy's on pace, and, we're continuing to innovate and get our products in the fleets of equipment up north.
Could we talk a little bit? I don't know who wants to take this topic. I wanted to talk a little bit. Actually, I want to clarify. What is this? What is this room we're in right now?
So this we call this is the assembly room. So a lot of the components that get done through this facility here, once they're ready to go back together, this is where they get reassembled, tested. This is a clean environment. There's no grinding or air arcing or anything like that, welding going on around here. So It's a clean environment, so that when you go to put something back together, obviously you want to keep everything clean. Contamination is a big problem in any of these assemblies. So you want to keep a clean environment, get everything put back together, tested, and then once it gets through here, then it goes back out, gets painted, packaged, and onto the customer and back onto the machine.
And this facility, this has been operating for quite a few years in this particular location, right?
Yes. I don't know the exact timeline. It's before my time. But L&H bought this facility in 2007. And before that, it was a different company called Industrial Plating and Grinding. In 2007, L&H bought this facility. It's been L&H since, and it kind of has evolved into a big part of the L&H portfolio, if you want to say.
Yeah, we're going to take a little bit of a walk through later and kind of show the audience some of the machines that are actually in here doing the machines that we see behind us. But can you maybe walk us through, and whichever one you want to take it, or you want to take parts and pieces of it, just that history L&H has with the mobile equipment?
So like I said, 2007, the facility got purchased by L&H. Before that, and as it got acquired, this facility did a lot of work on mobile equipment historically, whether that's graders, trucks, dozers, loaders, you name it. Obviously, that equipment has changed over the years. 2007 was a long time ago. And in the matter of life cycle of equipment, equipment was much smaller back then. It was a lot less complicated. It was a lot kind of crude, I guess we would call it. It was a lot simpler back then. So this facility was focusing on that at that time. Over the years, it expanded into something more. We started working on different types of equipment. We dove into laternal loaders was a big kind of, we had a lot of opportunities in those machines. So we focused on those for quite some time. And then, everything just kind of evolves and to do, and things for us to improve, and things for us to innovate. Then that's where we kind of strive for.
In a facility like this, what does that look like? You said the machines are bigger, so I'm guessing that means that the machines that you've got working in here need to be more capable, more precise, all of that. What does that sort of look like? Again, we'll do a little bit of a walk around and show some of those machines. So what does that actually look like in terms of actual machines in this facility doing that work?
Yeah, absolutely. With bigger machines means bigger components and more complex components. So we've kind of we chose to follow suit and innovate as the rest of the industry does. So what was 100% manual machining back in 2007 is now being replaced by CNC machines, bigger machines, more accurate machines, more efficient machines. We don't necessarily have a much larger crew of tradesmen working here, but the output has grown tremendously just with innovation and modernizing the equipment, modernizing the facility and all that. So it you definitely have to keep up with what's going on in this industry.
I want to jump into the sort of the Canadian side as well, but I want to ask a quick question about Letourneau. You said that was sort of the big why. What was the environment? Why did that particular brand of machine sort of get so much attention or so much demand in that at that time?
It just was, there was a time when we found a niche market that we were going to be good at, and we focused on that market because a lot of customers were having issues with their Letourneau loader or having, whether it's a reliability issue, whether it's a supply issue, whether it's an availability, having another option as far as who they can get some of these components with and who to help them, solve problems on these machines. So that was a market that we, fit L&H very well. And we're moving into different markets, different machines.
Yeah.
But yeah, the
more
Letourneau
expansion.
the Letourneau products were very big for us. A lot of stuff got done here, a lot of innovation.
I want to go back to, because I think there's a discussion to be had about sort of the pivots that you made even like in the last few years. But I wanted to just maybe lay the ground for what is it? What's the market in Canada that you're strong in? I'm guessing Alberta's a big one. So maybe the landscape of the Alberta market, and then any sort of where beyond that in the Canadian.
Yeah, so predominantly L&H, going back to 2013, Dustin Rausch went up to the oil sands, and L&H had a proven product in the hard rock mines, and they reverse engineered components, and our undercarriages in the oil sands, arguably the toughest digging conditions in the world, are eclipsing 30,000, where previous benchmarks were 18,000 to 20,000 hours. So the Alberta oil sands market is, one of the most geographically condensed mining regions in the world with the amount of equipment. It's truly incredible. Within, an hour's drive, you have some of the 7 biggest mines in the world. And, just in terms of their innovation and, a need for good manufacturers and good partners, it's one of the, I find, obviously I'm biased, but one of the best places to be involved in the mining world. The customers are, they're willing to try new things and innovate, and that's where L&H strives. We make some of the most difficult components, the biggest components, and continually innovate to stay ahead of the curve. So
what is that edge? And maybe both of you could sort of give your perspective on it. Where is the edge that L&H has in terms of the actual product? You're replacing an OEM part. You're not just swapping it out. You're trying to improve it. What does that process look like that gives L&H that step up in the industry?
Well, like you said, we're typically not looking to be another supplier that's going to supply the same thing. We always look for how do we differentiate our products compared to everyone else, including the OEM. Obviously we're an aftermarket company, but our forte, I guess you would call it, is to not just provide the same thing, but an improved product that's going to help drive that, longevity of your equipment. We have customers that come to us with pain points that, hey, I've got to replace this component every 3 months, and I can't get anything that lasts longer. That's the kind of challenges that we look for. We have a great team of engineers and innovators and tradesmen that are really good at coming up with new ideas and new things. And I feel like that's where we really differentiate ourselves in the market.
I think to further touch on that as well is the nimbleness which we can move compared to, the OEMs who, they do a fantastic job at a lot of things, but, they're huge corporations with tens of thousands of employees where, our mobile division here, we have multiple engineers in the facility. We got design experts. We got, Dan with, 15 years of history in those mobile components. We can make decisions, almost on the fly, so to speak, where we'll work with the customer and we'll come up with a solution, whether, it's in a few days, couple weeks, a month, when, we're willing to try new things. And I think, that's where, I think we succeed as well. I think that flexibility and being dynamic is one of the strengths that we have. And the field of experts, like Dan said, we got the engineering team, we got draftsmen. And then also I think a lot of it starts from the top with the ownership group of, they're willing to invest in the resources. And, from looking at pictures, talking with some of the team here in Sheridan, as well as Gillette and Tempe, you see that, the investment in the company, where they're continuously investing in, I think you were just in Arizona. We got, some of the biggest machines in the world there that are separating ourselves from the competition. So, being able to, innovate and invest, and then, pass those savings along to our customers, whether it's quicker turnaround times, pricing, and then, quality. There's less touch points on these machines. And I think the strength of L&H is as well listening to our customers. What are your pain points, like Dan said, and, building those relationships and that trust with them. And, I think it's been a strength of the organization and our ability to adapt and innovate and try to stay ahead of the curve.
I actually wanted to then kind of dive into that a little more. So when you mentioned, you're not just replacing a part, you're trying to upgrade it, essentially. You have to have that relationship with the client. What does that look like when you've got them when you're offering them something a step above? They might not necessarily understand why it's a step above or how. So how do you go through that process with a client that they're now putting not just a replacement part, but an upgraded part? Now, usually I'm guessing you're hearing that when there's an issue, so that would help. But what is that process? Maybe let's use, the Canadian oil sands to start. And then so that communication, how does that happen? And then when it comes back to here and now you're making those parts, what is that? So maybe start with you and then jump over to the manufacturing.
That's a great point. So I think you have to have those relationships where they, you're at top of mind, where they're going to come and, hey, Dan, hey, Cam, we're having these issues, and, we'd like you guys to, dig in and put some time into this. So it starts with, whether it's getting out in the field or getting out in the shops and working with their hands-on guys, whether that's the mechanics, the foremen, the operators, and then bringing our engineers in, having Dan with that background and listening. So, typically you start the discussion, we then take stuff back and start, our investigation and analysis. And then, there's a lot of phone calls, a lot of Teams calls, a lot of in-person visits. You're looking at a year. So it's a lot of investment in time, resources, money, trips north, having those conversations, because they can't afford to, we always kind of, our customers make the joke, nobody's ever going to get fired for putting an OEM part in. So,
right. That's what I was kind of getting at.
So when you need a lot of buy-in, it's not going to be just one person, unless it's the, mine maintenance manager, et cetera, who's going to give the go ahead. So you got to check a lot of boxes, do your homework. And if you don't have the investment from your organization, it's just never going to take off, because, you have, say for a haul truck, for example, you have, $10, $12 million piece of equipment. If that goes down, then you got an operator, or even more so, say a shovel. A shovel goes down because they're trying out a new crowd pinion or a new shipper shaft. Well, then that, $40 million shovel goes down. Then you got 8 haul trucks. Then your plant suffers. So, you really have to build that trust within their organization and your products of what you're doing, to get the buy-in. And once you do, it's like Pandora's box of, oh, you guys solved this problem, let's move on to the next.
Yeah.
And it's, it's continually evolving. And, and I think Dan and I were just in a meeting up north, and, one of the customers said, like, so many companies can come in and sell a product once, maybe twice. And, you make a lot of promises and what have you. And then, 3 months, 6 months, the customer support's not there. The product quality isn't there. You promised 10,000 hours, it gets 5,000, and then you come into warranty situations. L&H has proven that we will stand behind our product, and that level of trust is there. And it certainly makes my job a lot easier when you have that brand recognition and, ownership going to site and building that trust in our brand. Cause there's the competition it's always evolving and growing. And the good thing with the mining world is there's some pretty substantial barriers to entry because of the cost of these components. And if something goes wrong, it's not going to be good.
Yeah. And then now that jumps over. So you built that trust, you've got the information, you've done the back and forth, done the flights up north, the whole deal. Now you got to actually build this. What is that process like here on the ground?
So once we have a customer interested in something, whatever that product may be, I mean, half the time it's customers coming up with their own ideas of how to improve something. They see the equipment operating, they see
where the failure is happening.
They see where the failure is happening. They see how it's happening. A lot of times they may not understand the inner workings of that component, but they see the failures. They see what it is. A lot of times they'll have their own ideas of, hey, we think this might help it. And then that's where you really work with them and get our engineers, which are really the lifeblood of this process. You have the engineers go through, figure out what's going on. A lot of times they'll figure out, hey, these are the forces at play here. This is what's, causing the failure. This is how it's wearing, or this is how it's, failing over time, or sudden failure, whatever that may be. And truly the engineers are the ones that go through and come up with a better process, a better material, a better design, better geometry, whatever that may be, to try and improve the life. And then they'll go through and conduct an analysis on our end, understanding what forces are at play on the equipment. And they'll, have a comparison of, hey, the original design got this much stress going through it because of what the constraints are. We came up and made a few changes, and this is what it looks like now. So the FEA helps them decide, like, hey, this is going to perform better out in the field. And then once that design is done, generally we'll go back to the customer and give them some options. A few times we've gone back and said, look, we have a few options for that we think are going to work. And half the time you have to go back and say, you can try option 1, 2, 3, 4. Whatever you think is going to work best, or if you think we would recommend maybe this one and this one as the most viable ones, and then from there it becomes a discussion with you and the customer so that everybody understands what's going on, and you can truly get a buy-in. And like Cam said, these big companies have to trust you and know that what you're doing, and a lot of times it's L&H is we're not a big company, but we're a big enough company to be able to support that and really have the nimbleness to get it done quickly and not have to get caught up in all this, bureaucracy of big corporations where you got to move really slow because you have to go through all these different departments. We're small enough to where we can be nimble, but we're big enough to where we can help make that product and help support it and have the back end of, once we figure out what works, we can help long-term support and get it, truly get it to the end of its life cycle.
Then, and I guess in most, like especially with the oil sands, you're talking real scalability, because once you fix that problem on a single machine, I mean, these are all fleets. These are major. I mean, some of the biggest fleets in the world are in like Alberta, for example. Yeah. So that sort of, I guess, in a business development goal, that's sort of what L&H is looking at. You fix this one problem. Now the fleets in that whole area are now
just with the size and scale of these fleets. You have, one of the fleets up north, they have 150 Komatsu 980 trucks, and just think we were talking about scalability. The OEM has done a very good job of it's given us time to chip away and I guess hone our abilities and innovate and show that, hey, like we're really good at this. And I think everybody wants to have another option. If you're held hostage, it's extremely hard to do business with only one partner. And we've seen that where, they need to have, whether there's global supply chain shortages, which we've seen over the last 5 years. And I think a willingness of a smaller company like L&H to really listen. And I think, customers get tired of hearing the same thing, and, their customers not listening, and, or their vendors not listening, and we'll get to it in 6 months, a year, or your roads are tough,
right.
And you're driving too fast, and just not listening, and they're selling tens of millions of dollars of parts. Do they really want to provide that like one-stop solution?
Right. Yeah.
And
150 trucks is a lot but in terms of global scale, it's a drop in the bucket, right?
For sure. And I think that, for us, we want to come in and solve those pain points because we weren't doing any of the business anyway. And then on top of that, it gives us access to more components, more pieces of equipment on the fleet. Like if you guys helped solve, an issue with our trucks, well, maybe we'll let you get on the graders,
right.
We'll get on the dozers,
right.
And we already have built that trust in the shovels, which are the most expensive pieces of equipment. It was just a natural progression of going to the mobile side.
Right.
We can get them there. We can provide all the evidence and research. And a lot of times it does come down to availability of, these upgrades. We've seen that just recently, and price. Once you prove that it's going to work, you'll get that investment. But if we come in and say, oh, let's try a new front suspension, it's going to cost you an extra $250,000 to try it, there's probably going to be very limited buy-in.
I didn't want to let something go that you touched on, and I think it's really important. So if something's on a contract, earlier you said it would take a year. So are you seeing situations there where their contract's up in a year, so they start that discussion around a year ahead of time? They're planning by the time you've got all the pain points figured out and ready for manufacturing, that you can then start that collaboration. Does it ever work like that?
No, I think just to get that certain product, I guess, life cycle was a year, but there is, I think with these contracts, every site is different, but there's, some are, like zero access, some if like the OEM can't provide, etc., or some
that voids the contract then. Okay.
And some you have, some sites they'll take one or two trucks off contract, and that's where they will try aftermarket providers to see if they can continuously innovate. And you get to understand why the OEMs, they have these contracts in place with the mine, and why mines use them as well, because, we can provide all these mechanical components, whether it's front suspensions, final drives, rear differentials, etc. But then they need, if that truck comes off contract, they need to have the engines, they need to have the electrical, they need to have the dump bodies. So it becomes a huge, I guess, transition for their procurement teams are these people going to have inventory? Or, it's an intricate game so we really have to prove that our products are worthwhile to get something off contract, to get that buy-in, because the easy button is just to go to the OEM and, they're going to have inventory, they're going to typically, and, but I think one thing about the oil sands is that, that need and want for innovation. How can we increase the life of our fleet? And with such big fleets, if you can increase the life of something, whether it's 10, 15, 20%, you multiply that over 150 trucks or 30 or 40 graders, or, 12 to 15 rope shovels. That's going to make a significant difference in your procurement. It's going to stretch out maintenance cycles and programs, and save, tens of millions of dollars to each site.
So when you're coming in, do you kind of see, I mean, in short of them, changing their whole road system, and you're coming in with 150 trucks that need to be changed over, is that kind of what they're looking at, like anywhere from 10 to 30, or does it really range?
It really ranges, and you're talking about the monitoring of the roads and conditions and all that. There's just as much monitoring these days on the machine itself.
Right.
So yes, you're monitoring the conditions, but you can also monitor and translate that into wear and tear onto the trucks and graders and dozers and loaders and all that. So now there's a lot more emphasis of, okay, these components, you can really nail it, or you can really kind of narrow it down to these few components are really failing and failing often. So how do we address those? So it really helps us understanding, this monitoring side as a whole. It's a whole new challenge for everybody to.
Will
make
you
sure have
sometimes
the
get
highest
that
quality.
data? Will sometimes the company share that
They'll-
sort of?
Yeah, they'll show us, like Dan and I just recently were up in the oil sands just last week actually, and you develop with those relationships, and they'll you got a test truck, if you will, and they'll show, like, they can tell exactly how fast it's going, the rate of pressure in whether it's in cylinders or suspensions. It's wildly impressive. So when you're bringing something to market, you better have done your homework, because you can't, like we said, that customer just last week, you can get away with selling something typically once, but that's going to be it. And I think that's where like Dan said, it all comes back to that engineering group of, their ability to stay ahead of the curves, and it goes back to the relationships with the customers of sharing information, and how do we get better. And I think we got a couple guys here in Sheridan, as well as in Gillette and Tempe, that are truly pioneers at their craft, and are extremely well versed in what we do, and I guess the industry trend, staying on top of that. And I think that the huge thing is, as well as the communication from what I get from customers, passing it on to the product line managers, getting it to the engineers. And I think if you don't have those frontline people getting that work, it's not going to work. And also, you can have the best frontline people, but if you don't have, engineers or that buy-in from the ownership group to invest in these products, I think that's where, that buy-in from the organization of, like, hey, we want to stay on top of this, and continually push the envelope of helping customers increase it, and they see it, they appreciate it, and I think it's worked very well.
I have two more questions. One is sort of like a technical question. Like, you've got, again, going back to Alberta, you've got some of the most extreme environments in terms of cold weather and that. So I'll ask that first question and tie into the rest of it. Is, with that, how much does that environment and weather affect what you're building, for what solution you're providing? How much of a factor is it?
It's a big factor. It's a big factor because it, like Cam said, it's the harshest environment for mining, and one of the harshest in the world. And you'll see, typically you'll see failures in the oil sands at twice the rate or 3 times the rate of where you would see, say, in South America. So if you can find a product that works, if you can develop and design and test and improve a product that works in the oil sands, you're going to have success everywhere else, because you've proven it in the harshest environment. It's going to work that much better in any other environment in the world, in the mining world. So that is a big thing for us. And also, a lot of times we do have to account for that weather and go with a specific, whether it's a seal or bearing or material or whatever it is that is suited for that.
So it actually changes based on that environment.
It absolutely does. And some of the products that we've been working on, our engineer team has been very strict of, look, it needs to meet this Sharpie test at minus 40 Celsius, because we know that it's going to see that kind of environment. So if it can't withstand that, we're not going to put garbage out there and have it fail. We needed to make sure we go to great lengths to ensure that it's going to last in that environment that it's going in. So you have to tailor your products. You try to get them as universal as possible, but a lot of times you have to tailor them to this specific environment, just because it's so much harsher than anywhere else.
And you touched on the next part of that question, was then that scalability on a global scale, because L&H does do work all over the world.
Yes.
That sort of pedigree that you get from that harshest environment in some ways on the planet, now you're taking that down into the Brazils and Peru and all these other countries. That sort of gives you a leg up now because you've worked. I mean, that's one, Canadian technology is kind of known for that. It worked here.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
Does that give you a lot of weight going into the other countries?
Absolutely. It's one thing telling somebody, hey, we worked with a coal mine or worked with a, whatever other mine it is, or even a hard rock. It's a different spectrum of conditions. So it's one thing to say, hey, it worked here in Wyoming in the local industry. And it's a whole different thing to say, hey, it worked here in Wyoming and we were able to make it work in oil sands in Alberta.
Yeah.
And going other countries, it's easy to say, look, here's what we've done here and here, and we can make it work in your site too.
Yeah.
So it really does translate into a lot of credibility with other potential customers. Once you've made it work in oil sands, chances are it's going to outperform anything else in the other environments.
Yeah, and to touch on what Dan said, like if, it's very like, region specific. Like if, the weather is obviously a huge factor, and the freeze thaw cycles, like right now in Alberta, it's minus 30 degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
But also too, it some of the most abrasive digging conditions in the world with the sand and bitumen. It's a very niche market.
Yeah.
And it's a great place to do business.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you both for coming on, and the more interviews I do, it's like I'm getting I'm getting paid to have an education on L&H. It's pretty incredible. So thanks for doing this, and looking at the equipment and actually understanding, because we've done episodes remote with L&H. We've done them on site, like at Mine Expo. But now actually getting to see multiple facilities and understand the capabilities, what's actually going into the process firsthand, it's been pretty special. So thank you for doing this. I'm sure, and I hope we'll do it again.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
And thank you, everybody, for watching. We'll have links to the mobile equipment capabilities of L&H in the description below. You'll also have seen a tab slide out. You can just click there as well. Give us feedback. You connect with both the guests. We'll have their LinkedIn in the description as well. Thank you for watching, everybody. We will see you on the next episode of Mining Now.